Good evening. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Proverbs. If you would like to, you can turn over to Proverbs chapter 1. I know that last week we had a bit of a dilemma with our video. For whatever reason, the video feed just cut out kind of randomly right towards the end of our class. I had posted a quick comment saying that we're going to start up in verse 8, and we're going to try to do that tonight. So we're going to be looking there in Proverbs chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 8. Hopefully we're going to get through the end of the chapter, and I don't know if we'll get into chapter 2 at all, but we will be looking at that in just a moment. As a quick reminder of some of the things we had talked about last week, we had got into the topic of authorship when it comes to Proverbs. And usually authorship is pretty straightforward. You get into any of the Pauline letters, you say, well, Paul wrote it. You get into any of the the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, you say, well, Moses wrote that. That's pretty easy. You go to any of the prophets and you just say, well, the name of the book is the name of the author. However, Proverbs seems to be straightforward. It starts there in verse 1, Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And you think, well, job's done. Go ahead and pack that away. However, Solomon is the author of chapters 1 through at least 21. Then you get into 2 sections of the wise. Chapter 22, starting in verse 17, is the sayings of the wise. And then there in chapter 24, in verse 23, is more additional sayings of the wise. Then you have the addendum that is added in by Hezekiah's men in chapter 25 through chapter 29. Those also are Proverbs of Solomon, but they seem to be added later, which is perfectly fine. Somewhere around the 715 to 686 time frame by Hezekiah's men. Then in chapter 30 and chapter 31, you have 2 additional authors, Agur, the son of Jekah, and King Lemuel, there in chapter 31. And you have those 2 additional ones that we don't really have any extra biblical information on. And it appears that they very well could have been Gentiles, especially King Lemuel, because he would be a king that is not listed for us in any of the chronicles of the kings of Israel or Judah. So it would appear that you have a couple of those additional authors that add a little interesting effect to the book. So authorship is not the most easy thing, just to straight say, well, obviously it's written by Solomon. The dating of the book is not nearly as important for Proverbs as it is with other books. Now, while this is obviously in the Old Testament, this is not law, rather, this is wisdom literature. And it doesn't really have a large effect on understanding the context, nor does it have a large effect on the application. Wisdom is wisdom because it comes from God, and it is rather timeless. And so while there are sections of the Old Testament you say, well, there are things we can learn from but are not directly applicable to our lives, Proverbs is not that way. There is so much that we can apply directly to our lives here in Proverbs. Obviously, the biggest theme of the book is the imparting of wisdom. And the general audience, as he gives out in chapter 1, verses 4 through 5, is really anybody who wants to either continue to grow in wisdom that they already have, or individuals who are kind of on the fence, people that he would call the simple, who want to learn wisdom, the youth, and those who have understanding. And he uses several character types throughout the book to do that. He describes the wise, and this is going to be a caricature of the wise. Individuals who brace God's covenant on a daily basis. He describes the fool, which is kind of the opposite of the wise, the person who opposes God's will or his covenant. He also describes the simple. The simple would be people who are neither committed to wisdom nor committed to folly. And there's other terms that kind of seem to range on that spectrum. The righteous, the upright, the diligent, and the understanding are all terms for those on that spectrum of wise. The wicked, the lazy, and the lacking in sense are all on the spectrum of those who are fools. And all of these are caricatures to help highlight and to bring notice to the things that the proverb writer is wanting to talk about. So there are some major distinctions in the book. We had mentioned this really briefly last week as well. Chapters 1 through 9 are all things that are getting you ready for the actual Proverbs. Remember, Proverbs are usually 2 to 3 line simple sayings, things that should be easily memorizable so that you can then apply them to your life as you see those occasions come up. And if you notice, chapters 1 through 9 don't really have those type of proverbs. In fact, all of those chapters kind of lead you up to the understanding of Proverbs. So it gives you the base understanding, the base knowledge that you need to start working from there. So in chapter 10 and in verse 1, it says the Proverbs of Solomon, and then he begins to list those Proverbs in chapter 10. There is some other smaller context inside of chapters 10 through chapter 22, and hopefully we'll talk about that as time comes up. Starting in chapter 2, you have the sayings of the wise, in fact, the 30 sayings of the wise, and they go together. You then have the break for the two other authors in chapter 30 and chapter 31 as well, but we'll get all to that in a few moments. So as you look at the first couple chapters, this is setting you up for understanding the later chapters. This is the call to wisdom, the enticement of sinners. This is the personification of wisdom who calls in the street, and the personification of the adulterous woman. You have all of these things kind of combined in these chapters to help prep you to be people who are ready, eager, and going to be applicable to the wisdom that starts in chapter 10 of the Proverbs. It's really, really good to start at this section so that we can, when we get to chapter 10, be ready for those things. So we had mentioned last week, and I know that this was kind of right where our recording ended, and the whole application crashed. So just want to remember that verse 7 is the key to the entire book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. We're going to see this again as you get down into a later part of chapter 1. He will mention to you there in chapter 1, for those who are fools, that in the day of calamity, that they did not love, or they did not have the fear of the Lord. This is going to come up again, if you look there in chapter 1, verse 29, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. He's going to come up again with this in chapter 2. In chapter 2, he's going to put this in the idea that as you grow in, you begin with the fear of the Lord, and as you grow in knowledge and wisdom, the fear of the Lord should also increase. And you have this cyclical pattern that the more that you learn, the more you should fear God. And the more that you fear God, the more that you should want to learn and desire to learn from him. So we're going to begin there in chapter 1, verse 8. Let's go ahead and read verses 8 through verse 19 together. There in verse 8, hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are a graceful garland for your head and a pendant for your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole, like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, and we will all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your feet from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird, but those men lie in wait for their own blood, and they set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. This is the enticement of sin. This is where he kind of begins, that we need to start there in verse 8. To hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teaching. This is this contrast that we're going to see throughout the entire book, or this doubling, where he talks about the father and then the mother. Or as you have the contrast, it would be hear the wise and do not listen to the fool. But both of that comes back and forth. But he begins here with the idea that wisdom begins in the home, or wisdom should begin in the home. This is the very fundamental of all Jewish life. There in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as Moses is giving the speeches to those coming into, or those who are going to inherit the land, he begins with the great commandment there in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as signs on your hand, and they shall be as frontals between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gate. The wisdom that Solomon here is advocating for should be things that are taught in the home. And it's hard sometimes for children to, respect their parents, or especially as they're coming up. He mentions here back in the earlier part of chapter 1 that he's going to be, writing to understand wisdom and instruction in verse 2, to receive instructions in wise dealing in verse 3, to give prudence to the simple, and knowledge and discretion to the youth. And this is something that should be happening inside the home. And we as children, or we who are children, should heed this. Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teaching. And while obviously this is Solomon writing, he is not addressing one particular son and calling for himself to be their guide. Nor is he talking to their one particular mother, out of all of Solomon's wives, to be the one that they listen to. But this is a general audience that he's writing to. And he's writing to the audience for them to listen to their father's and their mother's teaching. For they're going to do something for them. But there's kind of a couple things to consider here. If you are raised in a God-fearing home, then this bears repeating, to listen to your father and your mother. Not only when you're a child, but even when you're older. That if they continue to be people who are God-fearing people, that they should have wisdom that can impart to you. But what if you're not raised in a God-fearing home? What if that wisdom instruction has not been passed on to you? I have said before in the past, and I think sometimes wrongfully so, that most parents, or almost all parents, want the very best for their children. I have since learned of a lot of people who have given their children just terrible, terrible advice and a lot of bad wisdom, bad instructions. And you kind of wonder what kind of parent would ever do that to their child. Well, foolish parents, as oftentimes we are as parents. But there is other provisions given for us, maybe not necessarily as small children, but as anybody who comes to read the book of Proverbs. Timothy, Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 2, where he tells Timothy not to rebuke an older man, but to encourage him as you would a father, and regard older women as mothers, and younger women and younger men as brothers and sisters in Christ, and in all purity. There is a real sense that there are many guides in Christ. There are many fathers and many mothers, many individuals who would give you instruction and give you teaching. And while he may not always be speaking specifically of your physical father or your physical mother, that stuff is still provided for us inside the plan that God has inside the church. So really, really important for us as parents to consider, are we doing the very best that we can to lay down these instructions and to lay down these teachings in a way that's going to benefit our children? For us who are younger, do we heed our parents' instruction? This is going to be kind of a repeating theme throughout the entire book about listening to instruction from your parents, to bring honor to them and not cause them heartache. And then if we were not raised in a God-fearing home, are there other people inside the church that you can look to as fathers and mothers and to learn from them? He mentions here that this is going to be beneficial to them in verse 9, that it is graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck, that there is a benefit to it. It's going to cause honor to be bestowed upon you if these things happen. But this is, most things as you go through Proverbs are usually truisms. Truisms meaning that, for the most part, this is exactly how things are going to be. Not to say that in every single case, that's how it's going to be. If you listen to your father's instruction and your mother's teaching, does not mean that every time that you live that out, people will say, there's someone I respect. In fact, if we follow after God's plan and we use the wisdom that God gives us, oftentimes people will ridicule us for those very things. But on the whole, if we are people who are taught to be honest in all of our business dealings, honest in our relationships, genuinely loving, genuinely caring, people who are humble, people who are happy to be corrected when we were wrong. There's a lot of respect that is out there for those types of people. And that's the type of things we're talking about here in Proverbs. While obviously we are going to be dealing with some of God's deeper truths throughout the rest of the Bible, a lot of this is how to live skillfully within God's plan. So we'll talk about that as we go on. And then he gets into verse 10 where he deals with, my son, if a sinner is entice you, do not consent. He gives this grandiose plan in verse 10 and following. And while obviously if this is the case, do not listen to them, but even if the plan is a lot smaller, if the plan does not involve killing people who are innocent and plundering houses and filling up an entire house of booty, and if it doesn't include trying to swallow people up in Sheol and having all one purse, this is still applicable. If there are sinners who entice you, and he will get into a variety of forms of that. People who will entice you just to deal wickedly with other people. People who will entice you to deal wickedly with your spouse or with your own body. And he'll deal with that as well. And there's a variety of other things that he deals with. But he sets, a lot of these are caricatures, things that are somewhat overblown for us to clearly distinguish between those who are wise and those who are foolish, those who are righteous and those who are wicked. But ironically here, if you will permit me to kind of diverge for a moment, isn't this exactly what happens in Matthew chapter 26 or any of the other Gospels, where you have individuals who are waiting in or lying in wait to shed the innocent blood of Jesus? Proverbs was around for them. It had been around for hundreds of years, even close to 1,000 years by the time that Judas shows up on the scene. If he would have just memorized the first chapter of Proverbs, it should have steered him straight. Even if he did not believe that Jesus would be killed, which I know is an oftentimes popular belief, I don't have any firm conviction one way or another if he believed that Jesus could escape or could not escape. I think that might have been almost irrelevant to him. But here is someone who lies in wait to shed innocent blood, and Judas falls in headlong after that. And so they gives this grandiose plan that will let Sheol swallow them alive, and they'll go down to the pit, and we will fill our houses with precious goods and plunder, and we will all have one purse. I want to talk, if you will, compare verse 9 to verses 13 and verse 14. There is a perceived worth and a actual worth that happens here in these verses. Some people will look at verse 9 and say, well, I don't really care for a garland around my head, and a pendant around my neck isn't going to do very much, but a whole house full of precious good or a whole house full of plunder, now that's enticing. And he deals with that a little bit. And we'll look at this some more as we go on towards the end of the chapter, or the rest of the book actually, that there is this perception that these things are going to be worthwhile. That it'll be worthwhile to throw your lot in with others who are going to get you a whole house full of booty. But he gets into verse 18 and verse 19 and make the point that in the end, that actually doesn't do them any good, that God's justice is something that they cannot escape. And so he deals with that. He then makes the point that their feet run to evil and they make a haste to shed blood. But here for a bird in verse 17, he compares in verse 17 the bird to those evil men in verse 18. For in vain a net is spread in the sight of any bird. If a bird sees you spread a net, then they're going to fly somewhere different. They're smart enough to know, even though they are bird-brained. Here in verse 18, however, these men lie in wait for their own blood. It very well may be that they kill other individuals, maybe even hundreds of other individuals. And in the history of mankind, that is the case. And yet what he says is, when it comes to God's justice and God's retribution, they always lay in wait to shed their own blood. Such are the ways of evil who are greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. There are some people who we know the stories of individuals who live fabulously wealthy lives due to unjust gain and die a tragic life. I had the name picked out and it's escaping me. 1920s gangster in Chicago is not coming to me. Anyways, dies penniless with syphilis in Florida, which to some people may be an additional punishment, some people might be pleasurable. And while there is true that a lot of people who live in their unjust gain die a tragic death or die penniless or die young, that is not all that he's talking about there in verse 19. In the end, it is their souls that he's talking about ultimately. And so while there's that certain element of truth that those who live by unjust gain take away the life of their possessors, there's all kinds of other aspects he talks about as well. The peace, the security that he talks of in verse 33 for the righteous and those who dwell in wisdom. The security that they have in their mind as opposed to those who always live their life on the run and always have an eye over their shoulder. Those things also fit into verse 19 as well as God's justice. He then begins into verse 20 for the call of the wise or call of wisdom. And this is a personification that he'll use over the next couple chapters. He personifies these things in order to highlight them in a very wise way. So wisdom cries aloud in the street in verse 20, and in the markets she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? And how long will scoffers delight in their scoffing? And the fools hate knowledge. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called to you, and you refuse to listen, and have stretched out my hand, no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel, and would have none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Because they have hated knowledge, and they did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel, and despised all of my reproof, therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way, and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by the turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure, and will be at ease without dread of disaster. We'll see this, that Solomon starts off here with the call of wisdom. He will then somewhat digress into the topic of what happens whenever people disdain wisdom, only to get back into the call of wisdom in chapter 2, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But he makes the point here that wisdom is readily available. That's the point he makes here, is that wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market she raises her voice. At the head of a noisy street she cries out. In the entrance of the city gates she speaks. Part of this is an allusion in verse 21 to the wise men, the elders of the city, sitting at the city gates providing that wisdom. And that's kind of what he's speaking of. When you go into a city in Jewish times, wisdom should be sitting there at the city gates. And it should be there available to anybody who is looking for it. In fact, as you get over to chapter 2 and he talks about wisdom is given from God, that is part of his point, is that for the Jewish people who have God's law and have individuals who are trained in God's law, wisdom should be readily available to you if you want it. James chapter 1 and verse 5, James has a very, very similar point where he mentions there that there in verse 5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given. Wisdom is readily available. It's not that God is trying to withhold those things from you. We'll deal with it as we get more into Proverbs, but he does not tie wisdom and knowledge with education or necessarily even brains in the way that we think of it. People who could do arithmetic or have wonderful memories, who are able to gain vast information on a variety of subjects, a polymath. He's dealing here with the ability to act wisely inside of God's laws. It's the skill of living righteously. And that really has very little to do with brains or the smarts as we think of it, and has all to do with paying attention to God and to his laws. And that's what he's dealing with here. And so she cries aloud in the entrance of the city. She lifts her voice over the streets, and she cries out in verse 22 and verse 23, "How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? And how long will you scoffers delight in your scoffing? And fools hate knowledge." Some exult in their foolishness. And it is still surprising, and maybe it's surprising to you too, how many times people will make foolish statements on their foolishness and believe themselves to be wise and learned about it. There is not enough time to talk about all the things that people do, but you will notice as you get further into Proverbs and you start listening to people that they make a lot of foolish statements, and very proudly. And that's what she's dealing with here in verse 22. This is what she's crying out to the people. How long will you delight in these things? And then she says, if you turn at my reproof, then I will pour out my spirit to you and make my words known to you. Wisdom requires something to acquire it. And we'll deal with it specifically as we get into chapter 2, where he talks about seeking it like silver and searching for it like hidden treasure. There is requirements that go along with it. The same thing goes with James chapter 1. When you ask of God, the indication is not there in James chapter 1 that God just miraculously bestows wisdom into your brain, but he will allow that process to go through. The same thing we see here in Proverbs, where he said, the wisdom cries out here in verse 23, that if you turn to my reproof, then I will pour out my spirit to you. But he doesn't end with that statement. He continues on in chapter 2 of searching and finding and applying and then reapplying and so on and so forth. But there's some specific things he mentions in this section of text. One is not loving your own way too much. And what I mean by that is, if you look back in verse 22, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? Or how long will scoffers delight in their scoffing? There is a lot of pride in the way that we choose to do the things that we choose to do. It's our own way. It's the way that we express ourselves. Sometimes it's the way that we act. And you see it a lot, where you people who are just very happy, very proud in who they are and the things that they have chosen to do, even if it's foolish or even if it's just blatantly wrong. And as you get over into Proverbs chapter 3 and in verse 7, he encourages us there in verse 1, my son. Verse 7 is, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Part of being instructed in wisdom is to have this loose hold over our own way of doing things. The same thing goes when you learn any skill or anything. There are times you can go out and you can learn something your own self. You can sweat and hard work and knowledge. You can pick up how to do things. But when someone comes along who's a true master of it and says, well, if you try this or if you change this around, there's a lot of people who will say, well, this is my way of doing it. I'm not going to do it any different. And they're going to stay exactly as they are. And that's what he's dealing with here. That we in our own life oftentimes figure out how we're going to do something. And whenever someone who's a true master, Solomon, God, comes along and says, well, you need to change this or that, we say, well, this is my way, and I'm not going to change it, even if I'm flat wrong in it. That's what he's dealing with. There has to be this loose grip on the things that we call our own way. And in order for us to be changed, we need not to love our own way too much. And going hand in hand with that, we need to listen to reproof. That's what he says there in verse 23, if you turn at my reproof. And I know we've talked about this before, that we don't like reproof. We don't like being corrected. We don't like people coming along and saying that we have done things wrong. There's a lot of pride in our lives whenever that gets damaged when we see those things. Chapter 3 again in verse 11. So verse 7 is, be not wise in your own eyes. Chapter 3 in verse 11, my son, do not despise the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord reproves him who he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Those are the verses that the Hebrew writer quotes in Hebrews chapter 12 to remind us again not to hate being disciplined or being reproved. The same thing comes up over in chapter 12 and in verse 1. One of the things you're going to kind of realize as we go more and more through the book of Proverbs is that he will phrase very similar instructions in slightly different ways in order for them to really stick in our mind. Chapter 12 and verse 1, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. And that's what he says. And I know that we maybe have, I think we've used this verse about 6 months ago or so. And I've looked this verse up in other translations thinking, well, for parents' sake, maybe I need to find a different word for it. And almost every translation in modern English translates it exactly the same. He who hates reproof is stupid. So as you begin here in Proverbs chapter 1, you realize that what he's doing is he's prepping you for what he's going to give you later on. And part of that is understanding we need not to love our own way too much. We need to be willing to listen to reproof and take counsel. And that's what wisdom says here in verse 25, because you have ignored my counsel. Sometimes it's not reproof. Sometimes it's just someone coming along and counseling you in certain areas that you don't know about or areas that you are not doing as well as you should. And as you look in chapter 1, we should be seeking out counsel. We should be seeking out wisdom. We should be seeking out people who are going to help us in this regard. And wisdom says, if you are foolish and you hate my counsel, then there is calamity coming, which is the point that he makes here from verses 24 through 31, is that the wisdom helps only if you acquire it before disaster comes. So wisdom calls in verse 20 and 21, calls to the simple, calls to the scoffer, and calls to the fool. And then says that if you return at my reproof, if you take my counsel, then I will pour out my spirit to you. But starting in verse 24, because I have called you and you refuse to listen, because I've stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored my counsel and would have none of my reproof, then I will laugh at your calamity. Solomon deals with this in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He says that the wise have their eyes in their head. The point that he makes in chapter 2 is that there are some things of Ecclesiastes, that there are some things that we can avoid in our life by having wisdom. And that's what he's dealing with. There's no point saying, man, I wish I knew how to avoid a pit when you're stuck in a pit. It's too late at that point. Wisdom is there before calamity, or wisdom should be there before calamity. But in the middle of calamity, it's too late. And so wisdom says here in verse 28, and then they will call upon me, but I will not answer, and they will seek me diligently, but will not find me. For they would have none of my counsel, and they despise all of my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own ways. They have sown the wind, and they have reaped the whirlwind, as we would say. And they have filled their own devices. The simple are killed by the turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. What is his point there in verse 32 is, as I mentioned before, that there is something that we need to do to gain this wisdom. And in verse 32, there are those who say, well, I haven't actively run away from wisdom. It's not that I've actively turned against all those who would reprove me. It's just that I didn't do anything. Here in verse 20, wisdom calls, and in verse 32, the simple just turn away. It's not that they're being rude or malicious, but they just don't really care a whole lot. And he says that they're killed because of it. And the fools, well, they're just complacent. it's not that big of a deal. If it comes, it comes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not going to be that much of a difference. And he says that the complacency of fools destroys them, which is prompting us for chapter 2. But whoever listens to me dwells secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. Solomon's point is not that disaster doesn't come, but there is a certain understanding that there is a lot of disaster that can be avoided by wisdom. He'll deal with that specifically for Israel, that if they follow God's instruction, if they draw close to him, then they shall dwell secure in the land, and that disaster is going to be widely avoided. There's also the idea that on a personal level, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, that the wise have their eyes in their head, that they can see some of those things and avoid it. There's also the aspect that for those who do have disaster to fall upon them, wisdom will help even in that moment as well. And so, if you are going to be fairly well equipped if something happens, and you get to avoid most of them anyways, then why would you be at ill ease? Which is his point in verse 33. That whoever listens to me dwells secure and will be at ease. We have a few moments before our time is up for tonight. I want us to just kind of begin chapter 2. Let's go ahead and start verses 1 through verse 15. He says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, make your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it like hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding their path of justice and watching over the ways of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity and every good path. For wisdom will come unto your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil and from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness and walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked, who are devious in their ways." So he deals here with the idea that, yes, wisdom comes to you, but there is a process to go through. Part of it is listening. Here, he starts with treasuring in verse 1. If you treasure up my commandments with you, do you value what other people tell you in regards to wisdom? That is a really key thing. Now, some people and some of us have been foolish to not do that when we were younger. And this is our opportunity if we were that way. And if we have already gained some wisdom, we have listened to some people already, then this is an opportunity for us to continue to grow in it. But he talks about treasuring it up, to storing it up. But Jesus speaks of this in Matthew chapter 6. Where your heart is, there shall your treasure be also. And he deals with that inside of his Sermon on the Mount. That we should treasure things of wisdom. And he says in verse 2, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. This is a choice that we get to make. We have free will in this area. We can choose to listen or to not listen. We can choose to treasure or to disdain. We can have a choice to incline our heart or to harden our heart. All of that is us. And Solomon begs you, before he gets into his wisdom statements later on, to start that process, to get into the habit of looking for it, for seeking for it, for treasuring it. And then here in verse 3 and verse 4 is the if you call out, if you raise your voice, if you seek, and if you search. All of that is active. Remember, chapter 1, verse 32, The simple were passive, and so were the fools. Both of them were passive, and they were destroyed, and they were killed. Now, the opposite of that here in chapter 2 is seeking. Now, part of the wisdom we're going to be dealing with through the book is finding out who. There's a lot of people who are going to give you a lot of things. Opinions are cheap. Thoughts are cheap as well. Knowing who to talk to, understanding who to ask, and who to listen to is key. And that's part of what he's dealing with here. That we're going to be searching for that process. He says here in verse 4, if you seek it like silver, and if you search for it like hidden treasure. You can substitute silver for gold or for any other precious things. How many people back in 1849, traveled out west, left everything that they've ever known, and lived a hard miner's life in order to find gold? How many people traveled up into the Yukon? Now, we were in the southern part of Canada, and it was cold. It was cold for quite a bit. You move just slightly more north in Canada, and we were told that you get a solid 6 months of winter. That once it freezes for the first time, it just is frozen forever. Now, the Yukon is much, much further north than that, and yet people chose to go live in the Yukon for gold. Here's an old family story for Brittany's family, that her great-grandfather supposedly transferred a lot of his goods into silver and gold coins and supposedly hid them somewhere on his property. And it has been like a yearly thing or a bi-yearly thing for people to go and to look for that. There is something that nags for people who believe that there's a treasure hidden somewhere or hidden gold nearby. That there's this, I'm going to keep looking for it, and even when I see no results, I'm going to keep searching for it. And that's that intensity that he speaks of here in verse 4. The same thing, you give a little kid a treasure map and you tell them to go find a treasure, they are going to look all day for it. We should have that same intensity when it comes to wisdom and knowledge. That when it comes to understanding the will of God and applying it to our lives, we should never stop in looking for it. There should always be something in the back of our minds that nag us and say, well, maybe you can get a little bit more. Maybe you can search a little bit further. Maybe you can get a little bit better at this. That's what he's dealing with. And there's this circular process there in verse 5. I mentioned this back in chapter 1. That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So what happens if you fear the Lord, and by that fear of the Lord you begin to search? Well, you search, and then you will begin to understand more. You understand the fear of the Lord, and you will find knowledge of God. And then he mentions ultimately in verse 6, while Solomon's the one writing this, and he's as a father writing to his son, he says, it's the Lord who gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. There's a really simple rule, and if we don't grasp this to start with, then we're going to miss everything else. If wisdom does not correspond with what God has told us, then it is not wisdom. If something that seems wise or seems logical or seems good that is in direct contradiction to what God says, it will never be wisdom. I want to repeat that again. If it contradicts what God's word says, it will never be wisdom. No matter what our society says, no matter how far we think we have climbed on the evolutionary scale, which is a false scale, it will never benefit us. Male and female, God created them. God made us binary. And no matter what our society says, that is always going to be the case. Because God gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. If there is ever a time to repeat this, it is always repeat this, that wisdom and knowledge and instruction comes from God's mouth. And any time society or friends or family or even the church tells us something different than what we see inside of Scripture, they will always be wrong and God will always be right. Wisdom and knowledge only come from God. There is no additional source that says, well, I can contradict what God says, or I can add to what God says and it be wisdom, because God gives wisdom and from his mouth comes knowledge, understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright, and he is a shield to those who walk in integrity. He guards the paths of justice and watching over his ways of the saints. That's the key that he's talking about here. For any time that we want to gain wisdom and instruction, it is not in another book, it is in God's word. That is the point. And so he says here that by searching for it and by seeking for it, by looking towards God, then you will understand righteousness and justice. Remember here that Jesus talks about to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. Remember those passages that kind of had those easy identifiable markers. Matthew 23 is one of them, where he gives the woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, hypocrites, for you have tithed mint and dill and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Solomon deals with some of those weighty matters. And the way that you understand righteousness and justice and equity and every good point here in verse 9 is start with God. God invented justice. Where do we go to find true justice? In the pages of his book. Who created the ultimate equity? Well, that's God who created equity. Who created righteousness? Again, God created righteousness. We search for it in any other source, then we have missed the mark by a mile. He says, for wisdom will come to your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. There is a lot that we need to do sometimes to get that point out. A lot of humbling, a lot of humility, a lot of humble pie to eat, a lot of breaking of our teeth on that sour food. But there's a point in time where that knowledge becomes pleasant to us. There's a point in time where, as people instruct us, we will look and long for that information. And so he says that this will, discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you, and it will deliver you from the people that he spoke of back in chapter 1. Those who are their ways evil, and those who have perverted speech. Those who walk in the paths of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil, who love to pervert those who are on the path of crooked and are devious in their ways. Those are the people that wisdom will teach you to avoid. We're going to pick up there next week in verse 16. He is going to talk for a moment about this adulterous person. And while he's going to talk about the adulteress, it is applicable for adulteresses and adulterers. There is a lot to be said as we get in chapter 5 when it comes to the adulterous woman, again in chapter 6 and in chapter 7. As he uses a woman to personify wisdom, he's going to use a woman to personify lust. And since he is a man writing to his son, and while it's not just Solomon writing to his son, he's using this terminology, and he's going to be using it. So, and while specifically he talks about adulteress, he is going to the broader application applies both to men and women who are cheaters, and so bear that in mind as we move forward. So again, this is wisdom literature, and which means that he's going to be using some concrete terms to talk about broader applications, and that we see in chapter 2 as well. So we will talk about this as we move forward, starting in verse 16 next week, and then be ready, if you will, for the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3 as well. So remember, chapters 1 through 9 is all getting us ready and prepped in our minds and in our hearts in order to accept the things that we find in chapter 10 and following. So we'll work through this together. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you guys are staying safe and well, and I hope to get to see you guys soon. Have a great night.